This is also a time of change for my family.
The room did not erupt, it went silent. King Charles sat motionless as the court's decision was read aloud, and for one long moment, even the palace officials seemed afraid to breathe. The ruling was not just legal, it was personal. William had been named the rightful inheritor of Diana's entire private collection, and with those words, an old wound reopened inside the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles lowered his eyes to the file in front of him, and the silence around him became heavier than any spoken accusation. The court, meaning the legal authority that decides disputes and gives binding judgments, had formally ruled that the prince would inherit Diana's private collection. That collection meant her letters, jewelry, keepsakes, handwritten notes, sealed family items, and the private pieces of a life the palace had never truly escaped. William stood across from the king, with his hands still, but his face betrayed the shock he was trying to control. He had not simply been handed objects. He had been handed his mother's voice, her memory, and the power to decide how that memory would be protected. A senior court official read the final wording again, slowly enough for every person in the room to understand the blow. The collection had never been meant to disappear into palace control. It had never been meant to become another quiet royal asset, hidden beneath procedure and guarded by people who called silence protection. Charles did not interrupt. He did not question the official. He only pressed his fingers against the edge of the file, as if the paper itself had become too heavy to hold. William heard the words and understood why the ruling mattered. Diana's legacy was no longer being managed around him. It was coming directly to him. The king set the file down without speaking, and that single movement said more than anger ever could. For Charles, the ruling reopened years of sorrow, guilt, and control that had been carefully buried beneath duty. For William, it carried a different pain. The prince had won authority, but it was authority born from loss. His mother's private world now belonged to him in law, yet every item inside it would remind him that she was not there to explain it herself. Success and suffering arrived together, and neither father nor son could escape the cost. Camilla received the message moments later, and the queen consort went still when she learned the decision reached beyond familiar keepsakes. Camilla asked which items were affected, but the aide hesitated before answering. That hesitation told her everything. The ruling was only the beginning, because every person named by Diana's memory had something different to lose. For William, the ruling felt like a gift and a burden in the same breath. For Charles, it felt like history had returned with a judgment of its own. Between father and son stood the one figure neither could escape: Diana. Her private collection was no longer locked away in quiet storage. It had become the emotional center of a royal fracture. William stood apart from the others, holding himself steady, while the palace tried to understand what had just shifted. As Diana's eldest son, the prince was not just receiving keepsakes from a mother he lost too soon. He was also the future king, and that made the inheritance constitutional in meaning it touched the future structure and authority of the monarchy itself. Charles understood that danger immediately. The king was not only a father watching his son receive power. He was the monarch, the person at the top of royal duty, forced to accept that Diana's memory had moved beyond the crown, the institution that represents royal authority and control. William spoke quietly to one aide after the room had emptied, and his words carried more pain than triumph. "This is not possession," the prince said in a documented private account prepared for the household record. "This is protection." The aide did not answer at first, because he could see what those words cost him. William was not fighting for jewels or letters as trophies. He was fighting for the right to guard the parts of Diana that had survived silence, distance, and years of careful palace handling. Charles remained behind a closed door longer than expected, and the king's stillness unsettled everyone waiting outside. He had spent years trying to hold royal order together, and now that order had been pierced by the most personal name in his life. Diana's collection belonged to William now, not to quiet supervision, not to palace review, not to controlled storage. Charles knew why that mattered. If the prince controlled the collection, then he controlled what stayed hidden, what became family history, and what could one day shape how the next generation understood their grandmother. Camilla received her briefing with a face that hardened before it softened. The queen consort was told several pieces in the collection included letters never reviewed by the current household, and she asked for the sentence to be repeated. Camilla understood the threat was not a single object. It was the possibility that Diana's private words could return with emotional force no title could soften. Catherine learned the next detail from William himself, and she listened without interrupting. The princess understood that he could now decide which items remained private, which were archived, and which were preserved for their children. Then a sealed inventory list appeared, and one item on it pulled every heart in the palace backward. To understand why the court's decision hit so hard, the family had to return to the day-one conversation turned inheritance into war. The crisis did not begin in court. It began behind closed doors, at Balmoral, during a private inventory review that should have been routine. A single folder was opened, a single handwritten note was read, and from that moment, the palace knew Diana's private collection was no longer just a memory. It was evidence of a promise someone had tried to control. Balmoral carried the weight of family secrets long before anyone called the meeting dangerous. The Balmoral Inventory Review, meaning a private check of stored royal belongings at the Scottish estate, had been arranged to examine Diana's personal items and confirm what remained in palace custody. At first, the review sounded harmless. Officials expected jewelry lists, storage notes, and quiet paperwork. Then one folder changed everything. Inside was an old handwritten instruction connected to Diana's collection, and the wording named William as the intended guardian of the full private archive. A palace official read the note twice, because nobody wanted to believe the meaning was that clear. Diana had not treated the collection as decoration. She had treated it as a living memory for her sons. The private archive, meaning personal letters, photographs, keepsakes, and sealed family pieces kept outside public display, had not been created for institutional control. It had been left with emotional purpose. That mattered because William was not simply Diana's heir by blood. He was the son whose future would one day carry the monarchy forward, and the note tied that future directly to her voice. Charles heard about the note later that evening, and the king's face changed before he asked a single question. He wanted to know why the document had not been brought to him sooner. He asked who had seen it. He asked how long it had been inside the folder. The monarch sounded controlled, but the people around him heard the strain beneath each word. Charles understood the danger immediately. If Diana had written her wishes clearly, then every year of delay would look less like caution and more like interference. William received the same news separately, and the prince did not raise his voice. That was what made his anger more frightening. He listened to the documented account from a household aide, then asked whether his mother's wishes had been treated as a problem to manage. The aide had no answer strong enough to soften the blow. William felt the pain of it at once. Diana's words had survived, but her intention had been locked behind process. The folder listed jewelry, letters, photographs, and sealed personal items that had never been formally transferred to him. A courtier later admitted in a recorded internal conversation that parts of the collection had remained under palace review because the contents were considered sensitive. That single word lit the fuse. Once William understood what had been kept from him, silence was no longer an option. There were no cameras, no advisors, and no carefully prepared statement when William entered the room. Only Charles was waiting. The prince carried the ruling in his hand, but the real weight was not paper. It was years of restraint, grief, and unanswered questions. When the door closed behind him, the monarchy's most private wound became a father and son confrontation. William did not sit down. He placed the ruling on the table between them and looked at his father with the kind of control that made the room feel even more dangerous. The ruling, meaning the court's official decision that had legal force, had already named him as the rightful inheritor of Diana's private collection. But the prince was no longer asking what the court had decided. He wanted to know why the collection had stayed under palace influence for so long. Charles watched him carefully, and the king understood that this was not a discussion about storage. This was a son asking whether his mother's wishes had been treated as an inconvenience. Charles answered slowly, choosing each word as if one wrong phrase could break the room apart. He told William the collection had been protected to prevent emotional damage, public confusion, and another storm around Diana's name. The king said the palace had acted to preserve order. The palace, meaning the working royal household that manages duties, records, and public reputation, had believed silence was safer than exposure. But that explanation did not calm the prince. It sharpened him. William heard the word protection and felt the old wound open wider, because protection had somehow kept a mother's private legacy away from her son. William leaned forward and spoke with quiet force. Protection without permission became control. The words landed hard. Charles rose from his chair, wounded and defensive, and said there were burdens his son had never seen. He spoke of grief, headlines, pressure, and the impossible task of keeping the monarchy standing while Diana's memory lived like fire inside every room. The king was not begging for sympathy, but he wanted William to understand that his choices had not been simple. The prince did understand pain. That was why he could not excuse what had happened. William then revealed what changed everything. He had seen the inventory list from the Balmoral Review. He knew certain personal items had never been formally transferred to him. He knew there were letters, keepsakes, and sealed pieces that had remained behind Palace Review after Diana's own instruction had named him guardian. Charles stopped moving when the prince named one sealed letter believed to have been written for Diana's sons. Silence struck harder than anger. The king looked at William, and the prince knew the answer before his father gave it. Something had been kept back. Something had been judged too sensitive. William picked up the ruling, turned toward the door, and left Charles standing alone with the truth neither of them could soften. The argument shook the family, but the decision itself had been shaped by forces even the monarch could no longer command. Kings can command ceremonies, palaces, titles, and traditions. But this time, the crown could not command the court. The ruling had placed Diana's private collection beyond the monarch's reach, and Charles felt the limit of royal power in the most personal way possible. Somewhere inside the palace, a legal line had been drawn, and William was now standing on the other side. Charles read the legal summary alone, and the words seemed to drain the strength from his hands. The crown, meaning the royal authority attached to the monarch and the institution around him, could not override the judgment. The court had treated Diana's private collection as her personal legacy, not palace property. And that distinction changed everything. Palace property could be managed, delayed, reviewed, and quietly controlled. A personal legacy belonged to the person named by right, and the person named was William. The king rubbed his hand across his face, folded the paper once, then unfolded it again, as if the answer might change if he forced himself to read it more carefully. Camilla entered softly, but the silence told her the battle had already moved beyond influence. The queen consort asked whether any part of the decision could be delayed, even for a few days, even long enough for the household to prepare. Charles did not look at her at first. He only said the court had already spoken. Camilla heard the defeat inside that sentence, and she understood why it mattered. Delay had once been the palace's strongest weapon. Now delay itself had been taken away. A palace lawyer confirmed the next blow in a recorded legal briefing prepared for senior staff. William could now authorize a private review of every item in Diana's collection. The private review, meaning a controlled examination of each letter, jewel, photograph, note, and sealed keepsake, would no longer answer to the king's emotional caution. It would answer to the prince. That made his position stronger than anyone had expected, because he was not merely receiving the collection, he was becoming its guardian, the person responsible for protecting, sorting, and deciding its future. Catherine received the news from William, and she immediately understood the danger beneath the victory. The princess was told some pieces could be moved away from palace-controlled storage within days, and she asked whether Charles had agreed. William paused before answering, because agreement no longer mattered in the same way. Catherine saw the weight on his face. The prince had won the right to protect his mother's memory, but winning had pushed him closer to a family break. The first consequence arrived before anyone was ready. An order was issued to secure Diana's collection under William's personal authority, and the palace felt the shift at once. The court had spoken in legal language, but the fallout inside the palace was immediate, human, and impossible to hide. By morning, the palace was no longer moving as one household. Doors opened and closed with unusual urgency. Aides crossed corridors without speaking. Charles remained withdrawn. William became guarded, and Camilla understood that the ruling had changed more than an inheritance. It had shifted emotional power inside the monarchy, and everyone close to the family could feel it. William's team began preparing to take formal custody of Diana's private collection, and every step carried the force of a warning. Formal custody, meaning legal responsibility for holding and protecting valuable personal items, now belonged to the prince, under the court's instructions. That mattered because custody was not just about where the collection sat. It decided who could open it, who could review it, who could move it, and who could say no. William understood that power. He also understood the pain beneath it. His mother's letters and keepsakes were finally moving toward him, but the path had cut straight through his father. Charles avoided the scheduled family lunch, and the empty chair said what the king would not. The monarch had faced public storms before, but this one entered his private life with no shield left between duty and memory. Some palace officials saw the ruling as justice for Diana, a correction after years of silence. Others feared it weakened Charles, because the court had shown that even the crown could not control every part of royal history. The crown, meaning the authority of the monarch and the institution built around him, had lost ground to a son's inheritance. Camilla sat alone after her briefing, and the queen consort looked shaken by what the decision might bring back. She had lived for years beside Charles, inside a monarchy that tried to move forward. Yet Diana's personal words were now returning to the center of royal life. Camilla asked one aide whether the letters would remain private. The aide answered carefully, saying William would decide. That answer struck her harder than any accusation, because it meant the past was no longer being filtered through the household. It was being placed in the hands of the future king. William found Catherine waiting when he returned, and the princess read his face before he spoke. He told her Charles had not come to lunch. He told her one sealed box from the collection had already been marked for transfer. Catherine stayed quiet, but her eyes changed when he explained what the box was believed to contain. Not just items from Diana's marriage, not just reminders of heartbreak, pieces connected to her hopes for her sons. An aide confirmed the transfer in a documented internal note, and that confirmation moved through the palace like a blade. William did not celebrate. Catherine did not push him to speak. The first box was coming, and with it came the part of Diana's legacy no court could make painless. The palace had fractured under pressure, but the real turning point came not in court, not in council, but in one quiet room. The first box did not look powerful. It was not covered in gold or guarded by ceremony. It was simple, sealed, and devastating. William stood before it, with Catherine beside him. No aides present, no palace voices interrupting. For the first time since the ruling, the prince was not fighting Charles, the court, or history. He was facing his mother. William placed both hands near the sealed box, then stopped before touching it again. The box had arrived under his new authority, and that authority meant he now had the legal right to receive, protect, and decide the future of Diana's private collection. It mattered, because this was no longer a palace-managed archive. An archive, meaning a protected group of important letters, records, and personal items, had become a living inheritance in his hands. Catherine stood beside him, not as the Princess of Wales, not as a public figure, but as the woman who knew how grief moved through him when no one else was watching. Catherine saw his hesitation before he said a word. She placed her hand gently over his, and that small gesture steadied him more than any speech could have done. William took a breath, then opened the box slowly. Inside, beneath the careful wrapping, sat a personal keepsake from Diana, something simple enough to be overlooked by anyone who did not understand love. The prince stared at it, and the victory of the ruling vanished. In its place came the ache of a son realizing that the court had restored more than property. It had restored contact with a mother who could no longer speak for herself. William found the note after that, and the words on the outside changed the air between them. "My boys." Catherine did not reach for it. She let him decide when he was ready. The prince held the note with visible restraint, understanding at once why the box had mattered so deeply. Diana had not wanted her memory swallowed by procedure. She had wanted her sons to inherit it directly, without filters, without delay, without anyone deciding that her love was too sensitive to release. Catherine watched him lower the note without opening every page inside the box. William chose dignity over hunger, restraint over spectacle. He could have read everything at once. He could have searched for answers in every sealed corner. Instead, the prince closed part of the collection again, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that inheritance was not permission to invade. It was a duty to protect. William's restraint changed the meaning of the entire ruling. Catherine saw it clearly now. This would not be revenge against Charles. It would not be a public weapon against Camilla. It would be guardianship. Yet beyond the palace gates, the story was already moving faster than silence could hold it. William had chosen dignity, but the world was preparing its own judgment. By sunrise, the ruling had escaped palace corridors and entered the national bloodstream. It was no longer only a family matter. It became a public reckoning with Diana's memory, William's future, and Charles's silence. Across Britain, people did not speak about jewelry or boxes. They spoke about a mother, a son, and the monarchy being forced to remember. Morning headlines carried the story with a force the palace could not slow. The court ruling, meaning the official legal decision that confirmed who had rightful control, was framed as a defining shift in Diana's legacy and William's emotional authority. That mattered, because the prince was not just receiving private possessions. He was being seen as the guardian of a memory the public still felt belonged partly to them. Palace communications, meaning the team that prepares official royal statements and public messages, drafted careful language about respect, privacy, and family duty. But the public response moved faster than any approved sentence. Charles watched the morning coverage in silence, and the king did not reach for the remote until the final segment began to speak about Diana's last wishes. Then, he turned the television off before the words could finish. The monarch had survived storms before, but this one felt different because it did not attack his crown. It touched his past. It placed William's grief in front of the nation and left Charles looking like a man who had been judged not only by law, but by memory. William saw the same reaction from another room, and the prince refused to treat it like victory. He read the headlines, listened to the public praise, and stayed quiet. He understood why people were moved, but he also understood the danger. Grief could become a weapon if handled without care. Diana's name could become noise if the family allowed pain to turn into performance. The future king had won the right to protect the collection, but he would not celebrate a ruling born from loss. One newspaper front page captured the national feeling with brutal simplicity. Diana's legacy goes to William. Beneath it sat a childhood image of mother and son, and that single pairing carried more emotion than any palace statement. Outside Kensington Palace, a quiet crowd gathered with white flowers. Kensington Palace, the royal residence long tied to Diana's public memory, became a place of soft remembrance again. People did not shout. They stood. They waited. They left flowers for a woman whose private collection had suddenly made her feel present once more. The nation had spoken in headlines, silence, and white petals. Charles felt the pressure of it. William felt the responsibility of it. And inside the family Diana left behind, one final question no longer mattered. Who had control? The real question was what they would do with it now. The public had spoken with flowers, headlines, and memory, but the final verdict belonged to the family Diana left behind. In the end, the ruling did not destroy the monarchy. It revealed what the monarchy had tried too long to contain. Charles was not defeated by William. William was not crowned by Diana's possessions. Something deeper happened. A mother's private legacy returned to the son she had always trusted, and the palace finally had to accept that memory cannot be managed forever. Charles accepted the decision in private, but there was no joy in the surrender. The court ruling, meaning the official legal judgment that could not be ignored or reversed by palace preference, had become a permanent emotional and legal turning point. Diana's entire private collection now belonged under William's guardianship. Guardianship meant more than ownership. It meant responsibility, protection, and the right to decide how her most personal belongings would be preserved. The king understood why that mattered. The monarchy had survived by managing symbols, but Diana was not only a symbol, she was a mother, and her memory had finally stepped outside crown control. William spoke to Catherine later with a calm that carried the weight of everything he had chosen not to say. The prince promised her that Diana's most private words would be protected for the family, not used for power, revenge, or public victory. Catherine listened closely, because she knew restraint had become his greatest test. He could expose what had been hidden. He could force the palace to answer every uncomfortable question. Instead, the future king chose dignity. That choice mattered, because it separated him from the anger around the ruling. William had inherited his mother's collection, but he refused to turn her pain into a weapon. Camilla realized the same truth in her own quiet way. The queen consort understood the ruling had not erased her place beside Charles, but it had restored Diana's presence in a way no palace decision could reverse. She could remain part of the monarchy's present, yet Diana had returned to its emotional center through her sons. Camilla felt the sharpness of that reality, and the king felt it too. Neither could freeze memory. Neither could command the past to stay silent. The final sealed items remained private, and that became the clearest proof of William's intention. The prince did not inherit to punish. He inherited to guard. The monarchy adjusted to a new reality where personal legacy could stand apart from royal control, and everyone involved understood the verdict. Diana's memory no longer belonged to silence, strategy, or palace management. It belonged to her sons, and through William, it entered the monarchy's future with dignity restored. There is no next chapter to soften this verdict. Charles froze, because the court did what the palace could not. It gave Diana's legacy back to the child who never stopped carrying it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.